Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome to the Dixiecryptid channel. Thanks for clicking on the video. How's our people? You know, if you love good stories, if you don't care anything about Bigfoot research or all that bull crap, but you just love good stories and you don't like all the hoopla and the meanness that goes on in the Bigfoot research groups, you found your people. This is a nice place to be. Just take a look through the comments. The nicest people on the internet listen to this channel. I love everybody that comments. Y'all are so encouraging and I really appreciate you. We've got 3 stories in this video. I think you're gonna like them. They're all really good. Yes, you're gonna need to strap your weaves down and you're going to need to glue your dentures in because we don't want anybody spitting them out in the plate because these 3 stories are pretty cool. I mean, you're gonna love them. So let's not waste any more time. Let's get rolling with it. All right, here we go. This first story is awesome. I got it recently, and let's just get into it. The writer's name is Brian. I want to thank my friend Troy, who sent me a link to your Dixiecryptid channel about a month ago. Troy is one of the handful of people I've shared my story with, and I've known him most of my life. Since then, my wife and I listen to your past episodes several times a week and enjoy all the stories people have shared with you. Thank you for creating a place where the experiences can be told without bias or judgment. That's what we do, Brian. You sure got that right. I've lived in Texas my entire life and have always considered myself fortunate to be raised in a hunting family. My dad was born in the late 1920s and he set a high priority on sharing the outdoors with me and my family. Our parents would take off a couple of weeks each summer to take me and my sister and my brother camping, and Dad would take off time in the fall and winter to take me and my brother hunting. In the fall of 2000, a colleague from work introduced me to duck hunting, and I was hooked immediately. Oh, Brian, you got the bug, didn't you? I remember that. I remember it. It's addictive. I enjoyed how exciting it was and how much shooting you could do on a good duck hunt. This was quite the difference coming from many years of deer hunting where you might shoot once or twice a year or spend entire days hunting and never see anything. I also liked that you could hunt until about 10 in the morning and then move on with the rest of your day when the ducks stopped flying. I lived near Galveston, and during the duck season I spent most of my weekends hunting waterfowl in the marshes and bayous of Galveston County to East Matagorda Bay near Sargent, Texas. After several years of hunting diving ducks in saltwater, I was interested in puddle ducks in freshwater. The closest and most promising opportunity was in a forest near Houston. The Sam Houston National Forest is about 50 miles north of Houston. I didn't have a boat at the time, so I was looking for access to a lake with my truck. While looking at public access hunting maps, I found a prospective location near New Waverly and Lake Conroe. This location was not near any homes, and it had a small dirt road that ran within a short distance of the lake for easy access. I scouted the hunting spot on Saturday before the day I planned to hunt it. I showed up at 8 a.m. and there were several trucks parked on the dirt road. It was not long before I heard a volley of shots through the woods in the direction of the lake. Hunters were there now, and it sounded like a war zone after a few minutes. Clearly, this was going to be a great place for my first lake hunt when I returned. The company I worked for had what they called floating holidays, and you could use it on your birthday. I used this time off on December 23rd, 2003 to go duck hunting on my birthday. It was the Tuesday following my successful scouting trip. A downside to public hunting is getting to your spot before the others get there. Even though it was on a Tuesday, it was right at Christmas break, and I wanted to make sure I would be the first one at that section of the lake. I didn't have a second location if somebody beat me to that spot. so I got up early and arrived at 2 a.m. That section of the forest was pitch black when I arrived. I remember it being quite a contrast from when I was there a few days earlier at 8 in the morning. Also, there was no moon, and the trees soaked up much of the light from the stars. My gear was pre-packed, and all I had to do was pull it out of the back of my truck and go. I used a jet sled to move my gear around when I hunted in these marshes. It's an ice fishing sled that you pull behind you. It's got tall walls and floats and tracks well. It's almost effortless to pull the sled through the water even when it's fully packed. This is helpful when you have your shotgun, a blind bag, a bucket with a seat or a chair, ammo, and 2 or 3 bags of decoys with weights. So I put on my waders, I grabbed my shotgun, and I started pulling the sled through the forest in the direction of the lake. I remember how well the sled moved over the damp pine needles and through the trees, and after a short while, I arrived at the edge of the lake. The trees stopped 30 yards before the edge of the water, and there was short grass on the bank between the trees and the water. I was close to the middle of a cove that ran north to south 1,000 yards wide. Unpacking the sled at the water line, I took the decoys out into the water to set up my spread. While I was throwing out decoys, I heard a loud sound from the northern end of the cove. The sound was nothing I'd ever heard in my life before or since then. There's no way to accurately describe this, but it was somewhere between a wail and a roar with the intensity and volume of an air horn, and it was not a happy sound. I didn't have much time to contemplate the shock of this because now I heard a new noise. It was the sound of something running towards me. I could hear footfalls from what seemed like several hundred yards away. Something was running down the edge of the water line straight at me. The sound got louder, and I made out a huge creature running on 2 legs. This thing was bigger than any animal I had ever seen. It was many feet taller and wider than a human. It was shocking to see something that big in the woods. It was like seeing a giraffe at the zoo for the first time. From where I was standing in the water, the ambient light from the stars against the dark woods in the background allowed me to see this creature as it ran down the edge of the water line. It closed the distance from where I first saw it to where I was standing at a frightening rate. It swung its large arms back and forth as it ran. The length of its stride was long, and while its legs didn't appear to be moving very quickly, its speed was incredible. I was standing 20 yards out in the water as it approached, and instead of running towards me in the water, it stayed at the water's edge and it ran right past me. I was close enough to feel the weight of the creature's feet hitting the edge of the lake and reverberating through the ground to where I was standing. It continued to run down the bank to the other end of the cove, and I could no longer hear it. Then I stood there in the water, coping with the realization that Bigfoot was indeed real. I watched the dark woods in front of me. The woods were especially ominous now. I remember looking down at my 12 gauge and thinking to myself for the first time in my life, this is not enough. It was certainly not enough loaded with number 2 steel shot. Spending so much of my life in the outdoors and not having an experience prior to this, I always thought people who believed in Bigfoot were either confused, attention seekers, or had mental issues, but I was wrong. It was 3 a.m. and daylight wouldn't arrive for another 3 hours. My options were to stay there or try to make it to my truck. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I could hear small sounds coming from the dark forest in front of me. Twigs were breaking. I had no way of knowing if the sounds were from a normal animal moving around or more of what I had just experienced. I decided to stand right where I was in the water until the sun came up, and I kept my eyes on the trees ahead of me and only glanced at the lake when a boat passed by. The lake is over a mile wide where I was standing, and there was no hope of flagging anybody down that early in the morning. Feeling like I was being watched made the next 3 hours like an eternity, constantly wondering if I would be attacked. At first light, I started packing my gear. The sled rope around my waist, I held my shotgun in both hands, and I started making my way to the truck. The worst part of this miserable duck hunt trip was the last few feet to my truck. If this thing was going to kill me, it was going to be right at the last second when I was fumbling with my keys trying to get the door open. That's the way it happens in books and movies, and I was living out my own horrifying episode. I threw the sled and the gear in the bed of the truck, and I made it to the cab, and I took off. I didn't feel safe until I made it out of the woods and on the freeway a few miles away, and I thank God for allowing me to live another day. In a few days, it will be the 17th anniversary of this encounter, so I've had a lot of time to think about the events of that morning. I'm confident this thing could have killed me with little effort. With its speed and size, there would have been no hope for survival. I think the Bigfoot put on a display of force as a warning, letting me know that I was not welcome there. I believe it returned and watched me the rest of the morning, and it shadowed me as I walked out. Whenever the topic of Bigfoot comes up, the images of this thing replay in my mind. It's seared into my memory. I continued to hunt over the years, but I never returned to the Sam Houston National Forest. Signed, Brian. Brian, that's awesome. That's an awesome story, and I appreciate you writing it. Again, I just got this recently. It was so good, I needed to pull it up and get it out there. Plus, it was written really well, and I didn't have to do hardly anything to it, and I'm in a hurry today, and that worked. Hey, before we move on to the next story, I want to tell y'all something. I'm going back through all of my videos, picking out some of the most popular stories, and combining them into one podcast and posting those at What If It's True, at my What If It's True podcast. If you guys are interested in just listening to 2 hours nonstop of good Bigfoot stories without all my commentary and without all my talking that annoys so many people, that's the place to go. I'm not assuming you have or haven't heard some of these older stories, but there's new people coming to the What If It's True podcast, and I thought they might enjoy some Bigfoot stories. It's ad-free. You can get there on my website, dixiecryptid.com, or any of the podcast apps that are out there. Hey, I started using the Podbean app, Podbean, Podbean. I was using Stitcher, but that Podbean app is really, really simple and easy to use, and it doesn't have any annoying quirks or anything. If you're on an Android, check that out. Apple has its own podcast platform, but if you're on Android, you have several options, and Podbean, that's the one I'm using now. So anyway, there you go. I've put in 2 hour long Bigfoot stories on What If It's True, and I hope you guys can get over there and take a listen. Here's an email from Todd, and Todd writes, I struggled with my encounter for 6 months before I told my best friend for fear of being ridiculed, but I'm going to share it with you and your listeners now. I've worked as a truck driver for over 20 years. I've seen lots of interesting things during my career. I was working for a trucking company out of Salem, Oregon, hauling feed commodities for mostly local dairy farms. I was assigned to a new job that took me from Portland to Rochester, Washington, and Elma, Washington. I ran at night because Portland in the day on I-5 is a nightmare due to heavy traffic. I'd been making this trip for 7 months. There were 2 trips a night. Same trip, monotonous, yes, but it was trucking. I started my day at 9:30 p.m. I pulled out of the truck stop and headed towards my first destination, Elma, Washington, 100 miles away. Truckers see all kind of cool things in a regular day, and this day wouldn't be any different, or so I thought. I took my exit on I-5 onto Highway 12 and I headed west. There are a few small towns between me and my destination, but for the most part, this is a cruise control kind of road. The farther you get from I-5, the more rural it gets. Heavy forest and logging roads shooting off the main road. Well, I was kicked back listening to my radio and rounding a slight corner in which a logging road shoots off to my right. I've passed this same logging road 2 times a day for 7 months, and nothing has ever been there, not even a car. I passed this road and continued towards my destination. I made it a couple of miles down the road, and I had to pull over. I couldn't drive. A panic came over me, and it made no sense. My brain had not registered what my eyes had just seen. Now, I grew up in rural Oregon. I've been a woods kid all my life, and I've never had a problem identifying animals, and I was confused on this day. The rational me was screaming that I had misunderstood a reflection off my front glass. I spent the next 6 months trying to recreate that same scenario, only to fail every time I passed that road. I'm sure I know exactly what was there that night. It was standing 20 feet off the main road in the middle of the logging road entrance, kneeling down on one knee with its back towards me. It looked like a hairy, gray Volkswagen Bug standing on its front bumper. It was like it was caught right in the process of crossing the road to get to the river, and it dipped back to hide. For 6 months, I told no one about it. Finally, I decided to tell my best friend what happened, and to no surprise, he laughed at me until he saw the look on my face, and he saw the true emotion in my expression. He stopped laughing then, and he took me serious. He said he believed me and that I needed to research that area. I hadn't told him the color, and initially that was one of my big hang-ups. I'd never heard of a gray Bigfoot. Later, I typed in Bigfoot sightings on Google, Elma, Washington. The first several hits were gray Bigfoot sightings. I couldn't believe it. In 1987, there were sightings, and the sheriff department even sent 2 helicopters into that area to do flyover grid searches. Now I knew I wasn't crazy. I had become one of the lucky ones to be in this club. I had seen a Bigfoot. After doing my research, I contacted the BFRO, and I found that this area is a hot spot for researchers. Oh man, that's cool. I'm so glad you confirmed all that, Todd. That kind of puts things to bed for you. And I understand what you're talking about. It's like you catch a glimpse of something and you're like, what was that? And it bothers you for weeks. I've had that happen. It wasn't a Bigfoot, it was something else, or usually something else. But it's a great story, brother. I really appreciate you writing it. You did us all a favor telling us this story. Maybe there's some other people out there that now won't think they're crazy either. How about that? This last story is really good, and it's full of good information, and it's very intriguing. I think you guys are going to like it. The writer's name is Spooky. I'm not interested in Bigfoot research whatsoever. I'm not interested in camping out to look for them, gathering evidence of anything that has anything to do with looking for them to prove they exist. I know they exist. I've seen them. There is at least one clan that lives in this particular area, and I'm not the only one who has seen them. You could say that all the farmers who live in this area have seen it, and we all know they are here. We choose to leave them alone. I am, other than a farmer, a paranormal investigator. I live on my family farm that has been in my family for over 200 years. This particular house that I live in was built in 1860. Of course, it has gone through many updates through the years, and it also happens to be haunted. But that's not really why I'm sending this. Spooky, if you ever decide to write some stories about things going on in your haunted house, I would love to have those and share those on my What If It's True podcast. Just a heads up on that. This property borders the largest land state park in this state. There are thousands of acres of forest in this area, which a lot of people find surprising for this area of Illinois. Our fields are spread out a bit in this area, and instead of taking the highway, we would cut up over the ridge and end up on the blacktop road that ran behind the park. I've heard about Bigfoot all my life, and sometimes the other farmers in the area would mention seeing one or catching a glimpse of one from time to time. I didn't pay much attention to it because at the time, I never had an encounter. I would sit out on the back deck at night and I would hear wood knocks and an occasional whoop, but I never saw one. Sometimes I would take a baseball bat and hit a tree or even the railing of the deck, and sometimes I would get an answer. In the late 1990s, I cut up over the ridge and I was on the blacktop. I was almost to the back entrance of the park when this huge creature jumped the fence along the park. It was on my right and it stood in the road. I had to slam on my brakes or I would have hit it. And when I stopped, I could not have been more than 20 feet away. This thing was huge, and I'm guessing it was 7.5 feet tall and 3 feet across at the shoulders. It had dark brown hair all over its body except on its face. It had a broad nose, wide-set eyes, and a protruding forehead, and its arms almost appeared to be normal from the shoulders to the elbows, but from the elbow to the hands, the arms were long. It stood there and we made eye contact for what seemed like a full minute. I had the window down on my truck and there was a slight breeze and I caught a whiff of a strong odor. It was almost like a bad body odor, like someone who had not had a bath in months. It never made a move towards me, it just stood there, and then suddenly it crossed the road and went down the hill to my left. I tried to see where it was going, but the trees were so thick and I couldn't see it. It was almost like it vanished. The sun was setting, but it was not quite dusk, so there was still plenty of light. The sun that was left was behind me. I rolled up my window and I locked my doors and I turned around and I went back home. And when I got home, I told my mom what I had seen and she never said a word. She just nodded. Her response made me think she had seen it or at least knew of its existence. We never had problems with them coming down to the farms and bothering our livestock, but I think that's because there are so many deer around here and there's no need to come raid a farm. But listening to them, you can tell there are more than one. You will hear a tree knock coming from one direction, and it will be answered from another. The same with the whoops. This farm sits near the Mississippi River, and in December of 2015, we had what you might call a freak flood. We have flooding in the spring, but never in the winter. It was flooding our land, so my mother and I moved into a house in town. 3 weeks later, the floodwaters receded enough that we could have moved back, but we decided to spend the rest of the winter in town. We had a hired hand, and he called one day to say that he had seen a Bigfoot crossing one of the pastures near the house. This was the first time he had seen one, so he was very excited and even afraid. I went down there to check things out and to assess any damage from the flood. It had snowed a couple of inches the night before, not much. My farmhand and I went to the house and there were these huge footprints that looked like it had walked around the house and had even stopped to look into 4 of the windows. I believe they know who belongs here, and since we were gone, it was looking for us. I know it sounds silly, but that's my opinion. This is the only time I know of that one has come to one of our houses. We and the other farmers in this area have not been bothered by them except for a sighting now and then, one either crossing a field or walking along the wood line or along the river. Sometimes while out hunting there will be reports of a sighting. I'm not saying we see them every day, but we do see them when they decide to come out of the woods. They pretty much leave us alone and we don't bother them. We've been fortunate that they have not bothered our homes or our livestock. On October 23rd, 2018, my farmhand Mike and myself went to pick up some persimmons because we had had a frost a couple of days before, and that's the best time to pick them up. I also wanted to see if there were any pawpaws left, and even though it was a bit late in the year for them, any that were left will fall off the tree and the deer and other animals are going to get them, but I figured it was worth a look. Mike and I hopped into his truck and headed for the pawpaw trees because they were closer. And when we got there, we saw that there were some on the ground and some on the trees. Mike grabbed a ladder out of his truck, and as he was setting it up, he pointed to a tree stump about halfway up the small hill and said that he didn't remember that stump being there. I don't remember seeing it either. Mike set up the ladder, and as he was picking off the tree, I was picking some up off the ground. I picked a few up, I straightened up, and I was hit in the head with a pawpaw. "Oh crap," I heard Mike say. We looked up the hill, and that stump was gone. I told Mike to quickly gather up what he had and get in the truck. He grabbed the ladder and he threw it into the bed of his truck. I stopped and started digging through a backpack. We heard a grunt just inside the tree line 30 feet away, and we heard a big crack like something had stepped on a large stick. I was still fumbling through my backpack, and he was urging me to hurry up. I was trying to hurry up, but I couldn't find my phone. "Who the hell are you going to call?" he asked. "The phone has a camera on it," I said. Apparently, I had left the phone at home, though. I had some venison jerky with me that I had brought for the day. I pulled it out, and I stopped and laid some on a stump, and then I headed for the truck, and we left. Mike was in hysterics. "I knew something was wrong with that stump. It had eyes," he said. He kept asking me how I could be so calm. I finally persuaded him to stop and let me drive because I honestly thought he was going to wreck. He stopped, and I drove the rest of the way to Mike's house, and then I walked home from there. It was only about a mile. The next day, I drove out to the pawpaw patch to see if I could find anything. I had left a 5-gallon bucket with a few pawpaws in it. The bucket was tipped over and the pawpaws were gone along with the jerky. I looked around for footprints or anything else that I could find, but I didn't see anything. I drove out to the persimmon trees but didn't get out of the truck because some of the lower branches had been broken off. They looked almost like they had been twisted, and you could tell these were fresh breaks. We had not had any storms or high winds, so I can only guess at what broke them off. I never got out of the truck, and I went home. In July, I had to have some work done on my truck. I took it to my cousin who has a shop in the next county. He's a good mechanic, and when he fixes something, he does it right. He also gives me a break on the labor charges. Well, I bet he hates to see you coming, Spooky. He had my truck for a week because he had to wait on some parts to come in. And when I went to pick up the truck, he told me that he was going to the Great Smoky Mountains for a vacation, to stay in a cabin owned by his sister. He had seen bears and other critters on his last trip there, and so jokingly I asked him if he had ever seen a Bigfoot, because there are a lot of sightings down there. He went totally quiet. I had to coax him to tell me what was wrong, and he asked me if I believed in Bigfoot, and when I said yes, that I had seen him, he told me about when he and his wife and his son went mushroom hunting in the hills on the back of our property just last May. The three of them had been standing on a hill when one walked across a clearing below them. He said it was dark and it was walking on 2 legs. He raised his binoculars, but by the time he got them out to look at the creature, all he saw was its back. He told his wife and son not to make any noise and to walk quietly back to the truck. He didn't want to draw the attention of the creature. But that wasn't the only Bigfoot my cousin had seen. He was raised in this area. They lived on a farm up on the ridge. He didn't lean towards farming, so he got a job in town when he was 19. He worked late one night until 1 a.m. On his way home, he was about a mile from home when one came out of the woods and crossed in front of him. It stopped for a moment and then went into the woods on the other side of the road. It scared him so bad that he didn't drive on that road at night again for 2 years. Instead, he took a longer route home. He never told anyone about that until he and his family saw the one in May, and on the drive home, he told them all about it. I'm guessing he felt better knowing he was not the only one who had seen a Bigfoot. The area where these farms are isolated. The nearest town in any direction is 40 minutes away. The Mississippi, Missouri, and the Illinois rivers are not far away either. There are acres and acres of woods. It's a great area for Bigfoot to live and hide and not be seen for long periods of time. There are plenty of deer, berries, and other sources of food for them, and this is probably why they've not raided our farms. But we also know that these things are dangerous. They have enormous strength, and at any time they could turn on us if they had a mind to. Live and let live only goes so far when dealing with a non-human creature, but we give them a wide path. Not long ago, the man down the road told me about being in his field checking his corn when one appeared out of nowhere. He was almost face to face with it, and it shook him up pretty good. I grew up on this farm. I was born on it. I played in these woods, and I hunted in them since I was 14. I fished in the river. I've been all over this area and never saw one until I became an adult. The first encounter, although it didn't traumatize me, changed my life. It made me aware that there are things in this world that you once believed did not exist. That's a strange statement coming from someone who chases ghosts. I know that. But the ghosts seem far more normal to me because I had been around them all my life. My dad was from Arkansas. I remember him telling me when I would be getting ready to go play in the woods, "Be careful, don't let them boogers get you." I never took him seriously because I always thought he meant the boogeyman, and I didn't believe in it. Little did I know that he is real. Signed, Spooky. Man, what a great story. That's like several encounters with several different people in Illinois. I kind of know where that is, and you guys do have some massive deer populations there. I think big trophy bucks come out of that area quite often. And Spooky, man, I would love to get some of your haunting stories for my What If It's True podcast. So if you ever have time to sit down and write those out, I would love to read those. So keep me in mind on that. I sure would appreciate it. And thank you for this story. It was wonderful. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you guys for tuning in, and I really appreciate you listening this far, and I hope you're getting ready for a great Christmas. And we'll see you guys on the next marathon. Thanks.